Hello and welcome back to another episode of The English Horror. I'm Sophia, your host, and today, we're diving into an exciting topic that so many of you have requested: how to think in English. If you're learning English and still translating everything in your head, don't worry, you're not alone. The good news is that it's possible to train your brain to think in English naturally, and we're here to talk about how. Joining me today are our regular guests, Daniel and Jacob. Welcome back, guys!
Hey Sophia, excited to be here again. Thinking in English is such a game changer, and I can't wait to discuss it.
Same here. It's one of those things that really takes your language skills to the next level, so I'm looking forward to sharing some insights.
Absolutely. So, let's start with the big question. Why is it so hard for people to think in English when they're learning it? Daniel, what do you think?
I think the biggest reason is that most people are used to thinking in their native language first, and then translating everything into English. It's a natural habit because that's how we learned languages growing up. The problem is, translation takes time and slows down communication. Also, not everything translates perfectly between languages, so learners often get stuck.
Exactly. And I think another reason is that learners don't expose themselves to enough English in their daily lives. If you only use English in a classroom or when studying, your brain won't switch to English naturally. The more you surround yourself with the language, through listening, reading, speaking, the more automatic it becomes.
That makes sense. So, how can someone start training their brain to think in English? What are some practical tips?
One of the best ways is to start small. Instead of trying to form full, complicated sentences in your head, start with single words. For example, if you're walking outside, try naming things in English like tree, car, siski. Then, move on to simple phrases like, it's a sunny day, or, I need to buy coffee. The idea is to get comfortable processing thoughts in English without translating.
That's a great tip. I'd also say that talking to yourself in English can be super helpful. It might feel weird at first, but just narrate what you're doing. Like, if you're making breakfast, say to yourself, I am making eggs. I need a plate. It helps train your brain to think directly in English instead of translating.
I love that. I think many learners don't realize that they can practice thinking in English even when they're alone. Listening to English content is another great way, right?
Yes, watching movies, listening to podcasts, and even just hearing English conversations can train your brain to process the language faster. The trick is to engage actively. Don't just listen. Try to predict what the speaker might say next, or repeat phrases you hear.
And another great exercise is journaling in English. Even if it's just a few sentences a day, writing down your thoughts in English forces you to structure your ideas without relying on your native language.
That's a fantastic idea, Jacob. The more we engage with English, the more natural it becomes. But I know some people might wonder, what if I don't know the right word? What should they do in that situation?
Great question. The key is to find a way around it. Instead of stopping and switching back to your native language, describe the word in English. For example, if you don't remember the word refrigerator, you could say, the cold place where I keep food. This keeps you thinking in English instead of getting stuck.
Yes, it's about developing the ability to explain ideas with the words you already know. Native speakers do this all the time too.
That's so true, and it's a great way to build confidence in English without getting frustrated. Now, before we go deeper into this topic, let's talk about the role of emotions in language learning. A lot of learners feel nervous or self-conscious about thinking in English. How can they overcome that?
That's such an important point. I think fear of making mistakes is a huge barrier. People worry about sounding silly or using the wrong words, but mistakes are actually a sign that you're learning. One way to overcome this fear is to practice with yourself first. Talk in English when you're alone, write your thoughts down, or even record yourself speaking. The more you do it, the more confident you'll become.
Yes. And another thing that helps is reminding yourself that no one is judging you as much as you think. Most people admire language learners and are happy to help. If you focus more on communication rather than perfection, it becomes much easier to think in English naturally.
That's such a great mindset shift. When you stop worrying about making mistakes, you free yourself to improve much faster. I also think that celebrating small wins can be really motivating.
Absolutely. If you manage to think in English for 5 minutes today, that's progress. If you go from translating everything to just translating, that's also progress. Small steps add up.
And rewarding yourself can help too. If you successfully think in English for a whole conversation or write a journal entry without translating, treat yourself to something nice.
I love that idea. Positive reinforcement makes learning so much more enjoyable. Now, let's go even further. What about dreaming in English? A lot of people say that when they start dreaming in English, it's a sign that they're truly thinking in the language.
Yes, that's a big milestone. It usually happens when you've been immersing yourself in English a lot. If you spend your day watching English content, speaking English, and even thinking in English before bed, your brain starts processing the language at a deeper level.
That's true. I remember when I first started dreaming in English. It was a weird but exciting moment. I think it happens when English becomes part of your subconscious mind.
So, if someone wants to reach that level, they should just keep surrounding themselves with English all day.
Exactly. Make English part of your life in every way you can. Change your phone settings, watch content in English, speak and think in English as much as possible. The more you do that, the more natural it becomes.
And don't be discouraged if it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, but every small step counts.
That's a great reminder. Consistency is key when learning any language. Now let's talk about some fun ways to make thinking in English more engaging. What are some creative exercises learners can try?
One fun activity is describing your day as if you're telling a story. Pretend you're the narrator of your own life. Instead of just thinking going to work, turn it into a short story in your head. This morning, I woke up feeling excited for the day ahead. I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside, ready to take on new challenges.
That's such a cool idea. Another thing people can try is playing word association games in their heads. Pick a word and think of related words. For example, if you think of ocean, then say waves, beach, blue, deep. This helps you make connections in English without translating.
I love these ideas. They make thinking in English feel like a fun challenge rather than a task. What about speaking with others? How can learners practice thinking in English while having conversations?
One tip is to slow down and focus on expressing yourself rather than finding the perfect words. If you don't know a word, use simpler English to explain it.
And don't be afraid to pause and rephrase. Native speakers do it all the time.
That's a great point. Thinking in English is all about keeping the conversation flowing. Let's explore more ways to do that. One thing I find really interesting is how different people have different approaches to training their brains to think in English. Some people like structured exercises, while others just dive into full immersion. Daniel Jacob, what are some personal strategies that have worked for you?
For me, it was all about surrounding myself with English in every possible way. I started by changing my phone's language to English. Then I switched to reading news and books in English. But one of the biggest things that helped was talking to myself. I know it sounds funny, but just narrating my day out loud in English really helped my brain get used to forming sentences quickly.
I can relate to that. Self-talk is a great tool. Another thing I did was set daily challenges for myself. For example, I would pick a random topic and try to think or speak about it for 5 minutes without using my native language. At first it was difficult, but over time, my brain got better at forming thoughts in English naturally.
That's a smart strategy. Setting small challenges. I think a lot of learners struggle because they expect to suddenly think in English all at once, but it's really a gradual process. Have you noticed certain moments when you realized your brain was starting to think in English more effortlessly?
Yes, I remember the first time I caught myself reacting in English without thinking about it. I was watching a movie and a character did something surprising, and I automatically thought, "Oh no, why did he do that?" in English. That was a big moment for me because it showed that English was becoming my default way of thinking in certain situations.
That's exactly how it happens. It starts with small moments like that, reacting naturally, dreaming in English, or even accidentally thinking in English when speaking your native language. I once tried explaining something to a friend in my native language, but my brain automatically formed the sentence in English first, and I had to translate it back.
That's amazing. It really shows how immersion rewires the brain over time. Speaking of immersion, let's talk about travel. Many people say that traveling to an English-speaking country is the best way to start thinking in English. Do you think that's true?
Traveling definitely helps, but I don't think it's necessary. What really matters is how much you expose yourself to English, no matter where you are. I know people who have lived in English-speaking countries for years, but still think in their native language because they mostly interact with people from their own culture. On the other hand, there are learners who have never left their home country, but think in English daily because they actively immerse themselves.
I completely agree. You can create an English-speaking environment no matter where you are. Of course, traveling forces you to use English in real-life situations, which speeds up the process. But if you can't travel, you can still practice by speaking with online language partners, joining English-speaking communities, or even just listening to English conversations every day.
That's a great point. So, for someone who can't travel but wants to fully immerse themselves in English, what are some creative ways to bring English into their daily lives?
One way is to start doing all your daily tasks in English. If you write a to-do list, write it in English. If you're grocery shopping, think about your shopping list in English. Even simple things like checking the time or planning your day can be done in English.
And another fun way is to change your entertainment habits. Watch movies and shows in English without subtitles. Listen to English music and try to understand the lyrics. And even play video games in English if you're into gaming. The more you connect English with things you enjoy, the faster you'll start thinking in it naturally.
I love that. Making English a natural part of life rather than just something you study makes the process much more enjoyable. But let's talk about something that a lot of learners struggle with: getting stuck. Sometimes, even when people try to think in English, their mind just goes blank. What should they do when that happens?
That's a great question. I think the key is not to panic. It's totally normal for your brain to freeze up, especially when you're trying to express something complicated. The best thing to do is take a deep breath and simplify your thoughts. If you're struggling with a long sentence, break it down into smaller parts.
Yes, and if you really can't find the right word, just move on and try to describe it another way. Sometimes learners get stuck because they want to say something in a perfect way, but it's more important to keep the thought process flowing.
That's a really important mindset. Progress over perfection. So, what's one final piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to start thinking in English today?
My advice would be to start small and be consistent. Don't expect to think in full paragraphs immediately. Start with simple words and phrases, build over time, and make English a part of your daily routine.
And I'd say make it fun. Thinking in English doesn't have to feel like work. Play games, challenge yourself, and enjoy the process. The more fun you have, the faster you'll improve.
That's such great advice. Thinking in English is a journey, but with practice, anyone can do it. If you're listening to this and found these tips helpful, keep practicing, keep immersing yourself, and soon you'll be thinking in English without even realizing it. Let's keep this conversation going in the next episode. And that brings us to another important aspect of improving English: confidence. Many learners understand English well but struggle to express themselves because they're afraid of making mistakes. Daniel Jacob, have you ever faced this, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, definitely. In the beginning, I was so worried about saying something wrong that I barely spoke at all. I thought people would judge me for my mistakes. But then I realized something. Native speakers don't care if you make mistakes. They care about understanding you. The more I spoke, the more I saw that people were patient and supportive. That really helped me let go of the fear.
I had a similar experience. I used to get nervous even writing messages in English. But then I started talking to myself in the mirror, practicing phrases, and slowly gaining confidence. One day I just decided to speak no matter how many mistakes I made. And you know what? The mistakes actually helped me learn faster because people corrected me in a natural way.
That's such an important point. Mistakes are part of the learning process, not something to be afraid of. But what about people who don't have anyone to correct them? How can they improve their speaking without feedback?
One great way is recording yourself. When you speak, record your voice and listen to it. It might feel weird at first, but it helps you hear your own pronunciation and notice areas for improvement.
And another trick is shadowing. It's a technique where you listen to native speakers and repeat what they say immediately, mimicking their pronunciation and rhythm. It trains your brain to form sentences naturally and improves your fluency.
I love that. Shadowing is such a powerful technique. Speaking of pronunciation, many learners worry about having an accent. Do you think it's important to sound like a native speaker?
Honestly, no. Accents are a part of who we are. As long as your pronunciation is clear and people understand you, your accent doesn't matter. Some of the fluent English speakers I know still have accents, and it never holds them back.
Exactly. The goal isn't to erase your accent, it's to make your speech understandable. If you want to improve pronunciation, focus on specific sounds that are difficult for you, but don't stress about sounding exactly like a native speaker.
That's such a good mindset. Clarity over perfection. But let's shift gears a little. What about writing? A lot of learners say they struggle with writing in English, even if they understand spoken English well. What are some ways to get better at writing?
Writing is all about practice. One thing that helped me was keeping a journal in English. Every day, I wrote a few sentences about my day, my thoughts, or something interesting I learned. Over time, my writing became more natural.
That's a great idea. Another tip is to write like you talk. Many learners try to write in a very formal or complicated way, but writing should feel natural. If you're stuck, imagine you're talking to a friend and write the way you would speak.
That's such a useful approach. Keeping it natural instead of overthinking. Another thing people struggle with is vocabulary. Sometimes learners feel like they don't know enough words to express themselves. How can they expand their vocabulary effectively?
The best way is through exposure. Read as much as you can. Books, articles, blogs, even social media posts. When you come across a new word, look up its meaning and try to use it in a sentence.
And don't just memorize words in isolation, learn them in context. For example, instead of memorizing the word enthusiastic, learn a sentence like, "She was enthusiastic about her new job." That way the word sticks in your mind better.
That's a great point. Context makes words easier to remember. What about grammar? Many learners feel overwhelmed by grammar rules. Do you think studying grammar is necessary to improve English?
Grammar is important, but it shouldn't be the main focus. If you try to learn every single grammar rule, you'll get stuck overthinking. The best way to learn grammar is through usage, by listening, reading, and practicing.
I agree. Instead of memorizing rules, focus on noticing patterns. For example, if you keep seeing a phrase like, "I've been learning," you start to understand how the present perfect, continuous tense works naturally without needing to study a textbook.
That's such a practical way to learn. And it reminds me, one thing that can really help with both vocabulary and grammar is storytelling. When you tell a story in English, you use different tenses, sentence structures, and expressions naturally. Have you ever tried storytelling as a way to practice?
Yes, storytelling is a fantastic way to improve fluency. I used to make up short stories and record myself telling them. It helped me get comfortable forming longer sentences and speaking without hesitation.
I love storytelling too. I even take it a step further. I watch movies or read books, then try to retell the story in my own words. It forces me to think creatively and use a wide range of vocabulary.
That's such a fun way to learn. And it makes English practice more engaging. Speaking of engaging, let's talk about one of the best ways to stay motivated while learning a language, staying motivated. Learning a language is a journey, and like any journey, there are ups and downs. Some days, you feel excited and make a lot of progress, but other days, it feels like nothing is improving. Daniel, Jacob, have you ever faced moments where you lost motivation?
Oh, absolutely. There were times when I felt stuck, like I wasn't improving at all. I remember thinking, why am I even doing this? But then I reminded myself of why I started. I wanted to communicate better, to understand movies without subtitles, to connect with more people. Whenever I lost motivation, I focused on those goals, and that helped me keep going.
Same here. I had moments where I felt like I was making too many mistakes, and I started doubting myself. But what helped me was tracking my progress. I kept a small notebook where I wrote down new words, expressions, and things I had learned each week. Looking back at how far I'd come gave me the push to continue.
That's a great strategy. reminding yourself of your progress instead of just focusing on what you still need to learn. But what about learners who feel bored with traditional study methods? How can they make learning more fun?
The key is to connect English with things you already enjoy. If you love music, listen to English songs and try to understand the lyrics. If you like gaming, play video games in English and interact with other players. When learning feels like a hobby instead of a task, it becomes more enjoyable.
Exactly. I started watching English TV shows with subtitles than without subtitles. It felt like entertainment, but I was learning at the same time. I also followed English speaking YouTubers who talked about topics I was interested in. That way, I was learning without even realizing it.
That's such a great point. Learning doesn't have to feel like studying. And speaking of learning from content, what about social interactions? A lot of learners say they don't have anyone to practice with. What are some creative ways to get speaking practice?
If you don't have English speaking friends, you can join online language exchange platforms. There are websites and apps where you can find people to learn your language while helping you with English. It's a great way to make friends and practice at the same time.
And if you're too shy to talk to strangers, start with something simple. Think in English. Instead of translating in your head, try to describe things around you in English as if you're talking to yourself. You can even record voice notes where you talk about your day. The more you practice forming sentences in your mind, the easier it gets to speak.
That's a great tip. Thinking in English removes the extra step of translating, which makes speaking more natural. Another thing that can help is participating in online communities, discussion forums, social media groups, and even commenting on videos in English.
Yes, engaging in conversations online is a great way to improve writing skills and build confidence. And since you have time to think before replying, it's less stressful than real-time speaking.
Absolutely. And another fun way to practice is storytelling challenges. You can take a random topic and try to make up a short story in English. You can write it down or say it out loud. It forces you to use new vocabulary and different sentence structures naturally.
Storytelling is such a powerful tool, and it also helps with another important skill, expressing opinions. In daily conversations, we often need to share our thoughts or explain why we agree or disagree with something. What's the best way to practice that?
Debating is a great way to practice expressing opinions. Even if you don't have a debate partner, you can pick a random topic, like is technology making life better, and try to argue both sides. It makes you think in English and improve your ability to structure thoughts clearly.
Another way is watching interviews or talk shows and pausing to answer the questions yourself. Imagine you're on the show and respond in English. It's a great way to practice forming opinions on different topics.
I love that idea, and it also builds confidence because you get used to thinking and speaking on the spot. Now let's talk about a challenge many learners face: understanding native speakers. Sometimes English sounds fast, or words blend together. What are some strategies to improve listening skills?
The best way is to listen to a lot of English content. But instead of just listening passively, try active listening. Pick a short audio clip, listen once, then listen again, and write down what you hear. Compare it with the actual transcript, if available. This helps train your ears to catch words more accurately.
Another great trick is watching movies with English subtitles, then watching again without subtitles. It helps your brain get used to natural speech patterns. And if you really want to challenge yourself, try watching stand-up comedy. It's full of fast, natural speech, slang, and cultural references.
Comedy is a great test. And speaking of slang and cultural references, many learners struggle with informal English. They learn proper grammar, but feel lost when native speakers use idioms, phrasal verbs, or casual expressions. How can they get better at understanding natural conversations?
The best way is exposure. Follow social media pages, watch vlogs, and listen to podcasts where people speak naturally. Keep a small notebook where you write down any slang or informal phrases you hear, then try using them in your own sentences.
Yes, and don't just memorize slang, learn in context. For example, if you hear, "That movie was a letdown," don't just learn the word letdown. Learn it with an example sentence so you understand when and how to use it.
That's a great approach. And on that note, let's dive into another interesting topic: how to sound more natural when speaking English. How to sound more natural when speaking English. Many learners struggle with pronunciation, intonation, and even confidence in their voice. Daniel, Jacob, what do you think makes a person sound more fluent and natural?
One of the biggest factors is rhythm and intonation. English has a natural flow. It's not just about pronouncing words correctly but also about stressing the right syllables and using the right tone. Native speakers don't say every word with equal emphasis. Some words are stressed, while others are spoken quickly.
Exactly. And that's why listening to native speakers helps so much. I always tell learners to shadow conversations. Listen to a short clip, then repeat what they hear immediately, mimicking the speaker's tone and pace. It's like copying the melody of English.
That's a great tip. Shadowing trains your ears and your mouth to work together. But pronunciation can still be tricky, especially with words that sound similar or silent letters. What's the best way to improve that?
I'd say recording yourself is one of the best methods. Pick a passage or a conversation script, read it aloud, and record it. Then compare it with a native speaker's pronunciation. This helps you notice where you sound different and what you need to adjust.
Another fun way is to break words into syllables. Many learners struggle with long words because they try to say everything at once. Instead, if you slow it down and pronounce each syllable clearly, you can gradually speed up and get it right.
That's a good technique. Also, tongue twisters can be useful. They train your mouth muscles to pronounce difficult sounds more smoothly. Do you guys have a favorite tongue twister?
Oh, I love this one. She sells seashells by the seashore. It's great for practicing the tesh and s sounds.
Minus, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. It helps with the P sound and also builds fluency.
Those are classics. And speaking of fluency, many learners worry about speaking too slowly. They think fluency means speaking fast. But is that true?
Not at all. Fluency isn't about speed. It's about speaking smoothly without too many pauses or hesitations. It's better to speak at a natural pace, good pronunciation, than to rush and make mistakes.
Right? And one way to sound smoother is to practice linking words. Native speakers connect words naturally, like saying gonna instead of going to, or blending did you into didja. Learning these connections makes your speech flow better.
That's a great point. And something else that helps is learning common sentence structures. If you have ready-made sentence patterns in your mind, you won't have to stop and think about grammar while speaking.
Yes. Phrases like, that reminds me of, or, I see what you mean, help keep conversations going without awkward pauses.
And using fillers naturally, like, well, you know, or, actually, makes speech sound more natural too. But learners should be careful not to overuse them.
Definitely. Fillers can help but shouldn't be used in every sentence. Now let's talk about confidence. Many learners know a lot of English but feel nervous when speaking. How can they overcome that fear?
One of the best ways is to start small. Don't pressure yourself to have long conversations right away. Begin with short phrases. Ordering food, asking for directions, or even talking to yourself in front of a mirror.
Also, remember that making mistakes is normal. Even native speakers make mistakes. The important thing is to keep going. If you hesitate too much because you're afraid of being wrong, you'll never build confidence.
That's so true. Mistakes are part of the learning process. And one more thing, surrounding yourself with English as much as possible helps build confidence. The more exposure you get, the more natural it feels.
Exactly. It's like learning to swim. You have to get in the water to practice. Reading, listening, writing, and speaking English every day, even in small ways, will make a huge difference.
And most importantly, enjoy the process. Learning English shouldn't feel like a burden. Find ways to make it fun, and you'll see improvement faster than you expect.
And speaking of making English fun, let's talk about one of the biggest game changers. Thinking in English. Many learners translate from their native language before speaking, which slows them down. Daniel, Jacob, how can someone train themselves to think directly in English?
That's a great point. The trick is to start with simple things. For example, when you wake up in the morning, describe what you're doing in English. Getting out of bed. I'm brushing my teeth. I'm making coffee. The more you do this, the more natural it becomes.
Absolutely. Another great way is to name objects around you in English. If you're sitting in a room, look around and think, that's a chair. That's a window. The sky is blue. It's a small habit, but over time it helps you stop translating in your head.
That's such a good strategy. It reminds me of how kids learn languages. They don't translate, they just absorb words naturally. But what about when someone doesn't know a word? Should they stop and translate? Or is there another way?
I'd say it depends, but ideally, instead of translating, try to describe the word in English. For example, if you don't know the word for refrigerator, you can say, "It's a machine that keeps food cold." This helps you stay in English and improves your ability to explain things.
Yes, and a great practice is using a monolingual English dictionary instead of a bilingual one. When you learn words with English explanations instead of translations, you train your brain to think in English.
That's a fantastic tip. Now, let's move on to another challenge, expanding vocabulary. Many learners feel stuck with basic words and don't know how to improve. What's the best way to grow vocabulary naturally?
One of the best ways is through context. Instead of memorizing long word lists, read stories, articles, or watch movies and pay attention to how words are used in sentences. If you see a new word in action, it's easier to remember.
And making vocabulary personal helps too. If you learn the word delicious, don't just memorize it, connect it to your life. Think, the cake I ate yesterday was delicious. When you use new words in your own sentences, they stick in your mind.
That's so true. And repetition is key, right? If you learn a word once and never see it again, you'll forget it. What are some good ways to review vocabulary?
Flashcards are great, especially apps like Anki or Quizlet. They help you review words at intervals so you don't forget them.
And conversations. If you learn a new word, try to use it in conversation as soon as possible. The more you use it, the stronger it stays in your memory.
That's a great reminder. Language is all about use. Now, let's talk about listening skills. Many learners say they understand written English but struggle when listening to native speakers. Why does that happen?
One reason is connected speech. Native speakers don't pronounce every word separately. They link words together. Instead of, "What do you want?" they say, "Hadaya want?" It sounds completely different from what learners see in textbooks.
Yes, and native speakers also speak fast, use slang, and sometimes even drop words. That's why listening to different accents and real conversations is so important. It prepares your ears for natural speech.
So true. And a great exercise is listening to something at normal speed, then slowing it down to catch details. Many apps and websites let you adjust playback speed.
Right, and another good method is listening multiple times. The first time, just get the general idea. The second time, focus on key words. And the try to repeat along with the speaker.
And don't forget subtitles. Watching with English subtitles first, then watching without them later is a great way to train your ears.
These are all great techniques. All right, let's move on to speaking confidence. Many learners know a lot of English but feel nervous when talking. What's the best way to overcome fear?
The key is practice. The more you speak, the more comfortable you get. Even talking to yourself in front of a mirror helps.
And finding a language partner or tutor is great too. Practicing with real people makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. And recording yourself is another good trick. You can listen to your own speech, notice mistakes, and improve.
Right? And one more thing. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Mistakes are proof that you're learning.
Exactly, every mistake is a step closer to fluency.
That's a powerful message. Learning English is a journey, and every step counts. And to all our listeners, keep practicing, keep pushing forward, and most importantly, enjoy the process. If you liked this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment. And speaking of speaking confidence, let's dive deeper into overcoming the fear of making mistakes. Many learners hesitate to speak because they're afraid of saying something wrong. But in reality, mistakes are a natural part of learning. Daniel, how can learners change their mindset about mistakes?
That's a great question. The first thing to understand is that even native speakers make mistakes. They pause, correct themselves, and sometimes mispronounce words. The difference is, they don't stress over it. If you shift your mindset to see mistakes as part of the learning process, you'll feel much more comfortable speaking.
Absolutely. And a good exercise is to challenge yourself to make mistakes on purpose. Say something and then correct it. For example, if you say, "He go to the store," correct yourself immediately. "Oh, I mean he goes to the store." Doing this trains your brain to self-correct without feeling embarrassed.
I love that. It turns mistakes into a learning opportunity instead of a failure. Now, let's talk about pronunciation. Many learners worry about having an accent. Should they aim for a native-like accent, or is clarity more important?
Clarity is always the most important thing. Having an accent is completely natural. Everyone has one. Even within English-speaking countries, people speak differently. Instead of trying to erase your accent, focus on making your words clear so people can understand you easily.
Yes. And practicing individual sounds can help if you struggle with certain sounds, like the think or the in world, practice them slowly and exaggerate them. Over time, your pronunciation will improve.
That makes so much sense. And another trick is shadowing, listening to a native speaker and repeating after them, trying to match their pronunciation and rhythm. Do you guys recommend this method?
Definitely.
Shadowing is powerful because it helps with pronunciation, intonation, and even fluency. You don't just repeat words, you mimic the way they're said. It's like training your mouth to move in the right way.
And you don't even need a partner for this. Just pick a short clip, listen to it, and repeat it exactly as you hear it. You'll notice big improvements in how natural your speech sounds.
Great tips. Now let's move on to writing skills. Some learners find speaking easier than writing, while others feel the opposite. Why is writing important in language learning?
Writing forces you to think carefully about grammar and sentence structure. When you speak, you can get away with small mistakes, but writing makes you focus on accuracy. It's a great way to sharpen your skills.
And it helps with memory too. When you write down new words or sentences, they stick in your mind longer than if you just read or hear them.
That's so true. And journaling in English is a great way to improve writing. Even writing a few sentences each day about what you did or how you feel can make a big difference.
Yes! And if you're not sure what to write, you can use prompts like, "What made me happy today?" or "Describe your favorite place." This keeps things interesting.
And another great idea is texting or chatting in English. Since messaging is a mix of speaking and writing, it's an easy way to practice without feeling pressure.
That's a fantastic point. Writing doesn't always have to be formal. It can be fun too. Now, before we wrap up, let's talk about one final skill: reading. Reading is one of the best ways to learn vocabulary and grammar naturally. But what should learners read to get the most benefit?
The best thing to read is something you enjoy. If you like fiction, read novels. If you prefer news, read articles. When you enjoy what you're reading, you stay motivated and learn more naturally.
And don't be afraid to read at different levels. If a book is too difficult, choose something easier so you don't feel frustrated. Even children's books can be great for learning because they use simple, clear language.
Exactly. And audiobooks can be a great tool too. Listening to the audio while reading along helps improve pronunciation and comprehension at the same time.
Yes, and one more tip. Don't stop every time you see a new word. Try to guess its meaning from context first. If you check a dictionary for every single word, you lose the flow of the story.
That's such an important habit. The goal is to enjoy the reading experience while still learning.
These have been some amazing tips today. And to all our listeners, keep practicing, stay confident, and most importantly, have fun with English. Learning a language is a journey, so enjoy every step. And if you found this episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time on the English Har. One thing we haven't touched on yet is how culture influences language learning. Understanding the culture behind a language can make learning much more meaningful. Daniel, what do you think about this?
Oh, absolutely. Language and culture are deeply connected. When you understand cultural references, humor, or even body language, you communicate more naturally. It's not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about how people express themselves in real life.
Yes, a simple example is how greetings work in different cultures. In some English-speaking countries, people say, "How are you?" as a casual greeting, but they don't expect a detailed answer. If you start explaining your whole day, it might seem unusual.
That's so true. And in some cultures, being direct is seen as rude, while in English, people might say exactly what they mean. Learning these little cultural details helps a lot with communication.
Right. Watching movies, listening to podcasts, and even observing how people interact in real life can give great insights into cultural differences.
And don't forget idioms. English is full of them, and they often don't make sense if you translate them literally. Understanding idioms helps you sound more natural.
That's a great point. Let's talk about idioms for a moment. Do you guys have any favorite English idioms that learners should know?
One of my favorites is break a leg. It means good luck, but if you don't know the meaning, it sounds like something bad.
Oh, that's a good one. I also love hit the books. It means to study hard, not to literally hit books. These expressions make English more colorful.
I love those. Learning idioms is like unlocking a new level of fluency. And speaking of fluency, let's talk about thinking in English. Many learners translate in their heads before speaking. How can they train themselves to think directly in English?
The best way is to surround yourself with English as much as possible. Instead of translating, try to describe things around you in English. For example, if you see a tree, think, that tree is tall and green, instead of translating it from your native language.
And another trick is to talk to yourself in English. It might sound funny, but narrating your day in English, even in your head, helps train your brain to think in the language.
That's a fantastic technique. Even small habits like setting your phone and apps to English can help immerse you in the language daily.
Exactly. The goal is to make English a part of your everyday life so it feels natural.
Speaking of everyday habits, let's talk about consistency. Many learners start strong but lose motivation after a while. How can they stay consistent?
One tip is to set small achievable goals. Instead of saying, I'll be fluent in 6 months, set goals like, I'll learn 5 new words today, or I'll watch 1 video in English. Small wins keep you motivated.
And having a routine helps. If you set a specific time each day for English practice, it becomes a habit, just like brushing your teeth.
Yes, and don't be too hard on yourself. Some days, you'll feel motivated, and other days, you won't. What matters is that you keep going, even if it's just a little practice each day.
Progress is progress, no matter how small.
And with that, let's move on to another important aspect. Real-life communication. Many learners feel confident in the classroom but struggle in real conversations. How can they overcome this?
That's a big challenge for many learners. One of the best ways to overcome it is to practice speaking as much as possible. Even if you don't have native speakers around, you can join language exchange programs or find online conversation partners.
Yes. And don't be afraid of making mistakes. A lot of learners hesitate because they're worried about saying something wrong. But mistakes are part of learning. Even native speakers make mistakes. The key is to keep speaking.
That's so true. The fear of making mistakes can hold people back, but the more you speak, the more confident you become. And sometimes, people understand what you mean even if you don't say it perfectly. Communication is about getting your message across, not being perfect.
Exactly. And one trick I like to use is shadowing. It's when you listen to a native speaker and try to repeat what they say as closely as possible. It helps with pronunciation, rhythm, and even confidence.
Oh, I love shadowing. It's great for improving your accent and sounding more natural. Also, recording yourself speaking can help. When you listen to your own voice, you notice areas to improve like pronunciation or pacing.
That's a great tip. Sometimes we don't realize how we sound until we hear ourselves. And speaking of pronunciation, many learners struggle with certain English sounds. Do you have any advice for improving pronunciation?
One technique is to focus on difficult sounds in English and practice them daily. For example, the th sound in think and this is tricky for many learners. Watching videos that break down mouth movements can help.
Yes, and tongue twisters are a fun way to practice pronunciation. Things like, she sells seashells by the seashore, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, force you to work on tricky sounds.
Oh, I love tongue twisters. They're fun and effective. And let's not forget the importance of listening. The more you listen to native speakers, the better your pronunciation will get.
Right. Listening to podcasts, audiobooks, and even songs can help. Try to mimic the way native speakers say words and notice their intonation.
And don't rush when speaking. Many learners try to speak too fast because they think it sounds more fluent, but slowing down actually makes you sound clearer and more confident.
That's a great point. Clarity is more important than speed. Now, let's talk about vocabulary. Some learners struggle with memorizing new words. What's the best way to expand vocabulary naturally?
The best way is to learn words in context. Instead of memorizing lists of random words, learn them through stories, conversations, and real-life situations. When you see a word used in a sentence, you understand how to use it correctly.
Yes, and using flashcards with spaced repetition helps. Apps like Anki or Quizlet can remind you to review words at the right time so you don't forget them.
I love that method. Also, keeping a vocabulary notebook where you write down new words along with example sentences can be useful.
Absolutely. And the key is to actually use new words in conversation. If you learn a new word but never use it, you'll forget it. Try to include new words in daily conversations or writing.
Another trick is to associate words with images or personal experiences. If a word reminds you of something in your life, it sticks in your memory better.
Great advice. And let's not forget synonyms and antonyms. Learning words in groups can help expand vocabulary quickly. Instead of just learning happy, learn words like joy, cheerful, and content.
That's a great strategy. And another fun way is to play word games like Scrabble, crosswords, or word association games.
Making vocabulary learning fun keeps you motivated.
Speaking of motivation, let's talk about staying inspired. Learning English takes time, and sometimes people feel stuck. How can learners stay motivated?
Staying motivated can definitely be challenging, especially when progress seems slow. One thing that helps is to remember why you started learning in the first place. Maybe you want to travel, advance in your career, or communicate with people from different cultures. Reconnecting with those reasons can reignite your passion.
Exactly. And setting mini goals along the way helps. Instead of focusing only on the end goal, break it down into smaller steps. For example, I want to learn 10 new words this week, or I want to be able to hold a 5-minute conversation in English by the end of the month.
Small wins make a big difference. Celebrating every little achievement can keep your spirits up. Whether it's finishing a book, having a good conversation, or understanding a podcast without subtitles, it's important to acknowledge those victories.
And it's also about creating a fun learning environment. Learning doesn't have to be boring. Watch movies in English, listen to music, try games or challenges. When learning is enjoyable, it doesn't feel like work.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to switch things up when you get bored. Sometimes trying a new method or technique can bring fresh excitement.
I agree with both of you. Learning should be dynamic and adaptable. If one method isn't working, it's okay to try something new. And remember, it's okay to take breaks when you need them.
That's a good point. Consistency is important, but it's also important to avoid burnout. Taking short breaks or even a day off can help you come to your studies with a fresh perspective.
And most importantly, be kind to yourself. Language learning is a journey, and it's okay to have ups and downs. The key is to keep moving forward, even if it's just a little bit at a time.
I love that advice, Jacob. And I think we've covered a lot of great tips today on how to improve English, stay motivated, and enjoy the learning process.
Definitely. It's all about making the learning experience fit into your life, finding what works best for you, and sticking with it.
And remember, progress isn't always linear. Some days will be easier than others, but as long as you're learning and improving, you're moving in the right direction.
Well said, guys. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights today. I hope our listeners feel inspired and equipped with new strategies to keep improving their English.
It was a pleasure being here, Sophia.
Same here. Thanks for having us.
Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that learning English, like any skill, requires patience and persistence. Don't rush it and embrace the process.
Exactly. And remember that every step you take, no matter how small, is progress. So keep moving forward and celebrate your achievements along the way.
And if you ever feel stuck or discouraged, just take a moment to reflect on how far you've come. You've learned more than you realize, and the journey is worth it.
Absolutely, Jacob. Sometimes it's easy to overlook the progress we've made, especially when we're focused on how much further we need to go. But every day is an opportunity to learn something new.
And if anyone out there is struggling, don't hesitate to ask for help. There's a whole community of learners and teachers who can support you. Whether it's through online forums, language exchange programs, or even your friends and family, there's always someone to help you on your language learning journey.
Very true, Daniel. Having a support system is key, and if you're ever looking for motivation or inspiration, remember the English Har is here to keep you company.
And we're always here to share new strategies, tips, and stories to make your English learning experience even more enjoyable.
Thank you once again, Daniel and Jacob, for being here today and sharing your wisdom. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us. We hope you feel ready to take on your English learning journey with new energy and